Welcome to the second episode of the AI Tomorrow podcast, a biweekly podcast from the School of Philosophy, Psychology, and Language Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. In each episode, we will be exploring topics related to artificial intelligence, consciousness, and AI ethics. I'm your host, Bartłomiej Pochorecki, and the following is a conversation with Geoff Anders, the founder of Rutgers Research, a research institute that studies psychology, cognitive enhancement, scientific methodology, and the impact of technology on society. Geoff is also interested in the potential impact of new technologies, including artificial intelligence. AI Tomorrow podcast is available on all streaming platforms, including YouTube. I hope you enjoy this episode. You are an executive director of Rutgers Research. It is a research organization that studies early-stage science and impact of technology on society, among other things. Could you explain in more detail what Rutgers Research currently does and what are your future goals?
Sure. So our goal is to contribute to scientific advance and the scientific endeavor more broadly. We're focusing on early stage science. There's a question about what exactly early stage science is. This is something that we hope to understand better through our research, but everyone will have an intuitive understanding that the way that science was done originally is different than how science is done now, at least in many quarters. So, when you think of the sort of stereotype of science now, you think of people with large hadron colliders and lab coats and randomized control trials. You think of the institutionalized, professionalized version of science that came into existence, especially over the last 70 or 100 years. But we all know that when science got started, and so I'm thinking 1500s, 1600s, and so on, 17 and 1800s, this wasn't how science actually worked at this point. And then there's a question of, well, is there a distinction between how science works during its earliest stages and how science works later on? We're especially interested in this question because we have the hypothesis that yes, there is such a thing as early stage science, that it works differently than later stage sciences. In other words, this is the hypothesis that sciences can mature, and that as they mature, they come to use different methods. And then, if this is right, there's a question of, well, how exactly does early stage science work, and whether anything we could learn from that could contribute to scientific advance today. I'm personally especially interested in the social sciences. The social sciences are a case where nowadays you have people employing what seem, to me at least, to be more modeled on later stage methods. You have the use of mathematics, you have a lot of the statistical methods and so forth, for example, in psychology. But there are also lots of problems being encountered in the social sciences. I mean, you'll be familiar with replication crisis, of course. And so then there's a question of, well, how should we approach these subjects? And is there anything that we can learn from the history? You could think about the history of science as being the data set for meta-science. Meta-science is sort of the endeavor to try to understand what science is and how to improve it. Well, then there's a question of, well, what's the data set? You can look at current scientific advance, but really the largest breakthroughs are from the history of science. And so we hope that by investigating the history of science, we can figure out, we can help to sort of furnish a data set that will make it possible to think better about what science is and how science can be done. Now that covers our sort of main program, which involves doing case studies in the history of science. Apart from that, we did a bunch of research. So Leverage was founded in 2011. We did a bunch of what you might think of as early research in a bunch of different fields, especially pertaining to social sciences. And we're looking at publishing that and seeing whether and how some of the things that we came up with could be disseminated to larger audiences for testing. So that's a sort of second thing that we do. And then more broadly, we're interested in helping, sort of where we can to have people understand how science and technology works, and to help society sort of responsibly manage the scientific enterprise. And so we're interested in how science and technology progress there can be pushed forward in different ways. And then, of course, there's an interest in AI, though I'll say that that's not something that falls under the purview of my role as executive director at Leverage. This is something that I'm interested in personally and relates to some topics there.
Okay, so I saw that between 2011 and 2019, you had a couple of different research paths laid out on the website. And some of them had broader explanations, but there's also artificial intelligence that was there. And I was wondering, why is Leverage Research concerned with AI?
Well, sure, absolutely. So when we got started, the initial vision was that we would explore a whole bunch of different paths for impact and figure out which ones were the most promising, and then focus and put our efforts there. And so we had a sort of general argument that major changes come about as a result of advances in science and technology. So it made sense to do a review of different areas that relate to different areas in science and technology and see which are the ones that seem like they could be the most impactful and which are the ones where it seemed possible to make the most progress. One thing we examined was the question of whether we should go into AI and whether we should try to help out in some way with the progress in AI or AI safety or something related to that. We ultimately decided that that was not a good idea, so we didn't go into AI. But we did research on a number of questions that relate to thinking about AI and thinking about its potential impact on society.
Why did you come up with that conclusion that it wasn't something that would be beneficial if you dealt with?
There were a couple different reasons, but I guess I could sort of explain it like this. So it's well known there are plenty of benefits from artificial intelligence or AI algorithms. So your spam filter, for example, and facial recognition on your iPhone. There's tons of things like that. And then there's also concerns about what sorts of problems might arise from AI. There's more mundane things like maybe AI-enabled facial recognition causes certain types of problems. There's ways in which you could see that being used to sort of aid repressive states or regimes. But then there are also risks that potentially come about if you end up actually achieving the goal of artificial intelligence, or the original goal, and developing an artificial general intelligence. So I'm sure your listeners will be familiar with these distinctions, but just to rehearse for people who may not be familiar, there's a distinction between narrow AI and artificial general intelligence. The idea with AGI is that this would be something that, like humans, could apply its intellect or apply its optimization power to a sort of arbitrary target. There's an interesting question: what happens when you get something like that? Of course, science fiction gives us plenty of doomsday scenarios, but at this point, a large number of quite respectable people have come to the conclusion that if we get to artificial general intelligence, then the next thing that happens is that humanity gets wiped out. That's obviously a bad scenario, and so it's important to understand how plausible that is, and important to not sort of take unnecessary risks. So that's the background. We looked into, this is something that's been covered by other people. Eliezer Yudkowsky at the Machine Intelligence Research Institute is a sort of leading figure with respect to this, or one of the pioneering figures, I should say. Nick Bostrom at the Future of Humanity Institute is another person. We looked into this and concluded that, it is an interesting question of how far away such things are, how difficult it is to create AGI. But if you actually did create an AGI, then it could be incredibly dangerous. And so there's a big history of advances in science and technology causing major problems. And so, you think, well, what could possibly go wrong from looking at the nucleus of an atom seems hard for anything to really go wrong there, except, well, now we know nuclear chain reaction and nuclear weapons. And so there's an example there. There are other examples, like from chemistry, where I think a lot of people don't think about it, but one of the things that came about as a result of developments in chemistry is easy accessibility to explosives. Easy accessibility to explosives. Explosives were then used in different violent revolutionary movements and by anarchists. And then there's an interesting question, well, what happens to a society when you have widespread availability of things like that? So I think it's not at all unusual to think that pushing far enough in some scientific or technological domain will yield really large changes, and that those changes may not always be exactly what we were looking for. So I think, that's that, and this is something that has, while people focused on AI and not, and know about physics and maybe haven't thought as much about chemistry, I think that this is sort of a well-trodden path. What we looked into, in addition, were other sorts of issues that might arise with running artificial general intelligence research programs. So one thing that we came across that I haven't really seen substantially discussed was threats to such projects from interference from the outside. So, you've got your AGI project and you're trying to create transformative AI. Well, then there's a question of, do other people take notice and do they try to steal your technology? You could imagine that you're being very, very safe and you're being, responsible and trying to make sure that the things you create will be used for good. And then, relevant government agency breaks down the door and, nationalizes your research program and you lose control over it. Well, there's a question as to how plausible this is. I haven't seen it discussed much, but one thing people don't know or sort of frequently forget is that the Manhattan Project involved not only the proactive attempt to develop atomic weapons on the part of the United States, but also the attempt to interfere with and to learn from and et cetera other nations' nuclear programs. So there's this question of, if you're trying to develop AI, then how do you deal with interference from the outside? There's one further problem that we came to, which I haven't seen discussed much, which has to do with alignment inside of AI teams, where if you have people working on very powerful technology, then there's this question, well, how do you prevent people from stealing it? For instance, like internal to the team. And so maybe there are ways to do that, but this seemed like a thorny problem. And we thought that it seemed sufficiently difficult to approach AI technologically or sort of technically in a safe way. And it seemed likely that eventually governments would catch on to potential threats. And so then you'd have interference at a state level. And so then this just seemed like a really bad idea to get involved in. And so we're like, let's focus on something different.
So do you believe that AI singularity will eventually happen? I think you do, right?
No, I'm not committed to that. I consider myself to be open to new possibilities. Certainly, it's the case that science and technology have changed the world unrecognizably from how it was 500 or 1,000 years ago, and it could do that again. But I don't think that a particular technological development path is inevitable. I think that it's possible for humanity to determine its own fate with regard to its path through the technological landscape. And so I think that, there's, first of all, there's a question about the sort of technical feasibility of AGI, and that's one question. But assuming that it could be created, then there's still the question of whether humanity will actually choose to. You might think, well, once you make progress in technology, then there's no turning back. But that's not really true. There are a whole bunch of different cases where technologies have been developed, and then society decides to go a different direction. And then, at least for the foreseeable future, it becomes very hard to go the original way. I mean, before we started the podcast, you and I were talking informally about the space program and the Saturn V. This is a sort of really interesting example. People tend to think, and this is a sort of it's a very powerful narrative. The idea that technology always advances and never goes back. But right now we don't have the technical capacity. It would be quite challenging right now to put a person on the moon. This is the rockets that were used to do this are not currently in production, and putting them into production would, I've got some estimate somewhere, but it costs more than $100 million to spin the thing up, or on a per rocket basis, I think. I should just look for the stats, but it's something like 100 million to spin it up and 20 or 40 million per rocket or something. But really what you need for things like that, the reason that we got so far in rockets had to do with government support. Another interesting example here is supersonic flight. And then there's a strange way in which people don't keep track of the history, and it's hard to keep track of the history when it's so contrary to existing narratives. But we like the narrative of progress. But there used to be supersonic commercial airlines, or at least one. There aren't anymore. And so there's been a technological regress in that regard. And you might say, well, why is that? The story is roughly, in addition to the space race, there was also a race between the US, Europe, and Russia to produce commercial supersonic flight. Russia managed to get a plane that flew a couple times, and then they experienced issues with and shut it down. The US didn't end up producing it. Europe did. Europe produced the Concorde, and then the Concorde flew for many years, but was eventually decommissioned because it was too expensive. Well, so then what this means is when you think about technology as a sort of wave moving forward, it really depends what the current society's investment in the different areas is. If the society changes what it's investing in, then it's quite easy to lose technological progress. So then the way this relates to AI is, I think that, obviously getting humanity to agree on anything is an extremely difficult challenge. But not all destroying ourselves seems like one of the more plausible things we could get people to agree on. And so I'm at least hopeful that it is possible for people generally to, and for there to come to be a sort of worldwide recognition that certain technologies should not be developed.
Okay, I see. So you tend to apply certain case studies.
Yes.
When you talk about technology, and your research institute is concerned with past technological breakthroughs,
yes,
and the impact they had on society. And I was wondering, are there any case studies from the past that can help us to understand how the future is going to look after a potential AI explosion? But also, I have those doubts because AI is something so unprecedented that it's really hard to compare it to, let's say, I know this was related to something different, but let's say like to a Concorde, because it's a certain technology that's disposable. But
Sure.
Let's say AI can just get out of control and we can just have it here forever in the universe. So I was wondering, do you feel like there are the case studies that can help us understand the future with AI after the explosion, or is it something so unprecedented that we'll not be able to learn anything from the past?
Well, I think that there's usually something that you can learn from the past. I do think that so to be clear, an AI generated intelligence explosion or the sort of singularity takeoff scenarios, frequently the scenario people have in mind is that you get something that is generally intelligent and can reprogram itself and make itself faster and smarter. And so then once you get it to a high enough level to be able to do good AI research, then it does research so as to reprogram itself so as to become faster and better, et cetera. And then once that happens, it's unclear how powerful the thing ends up becoming. If it becomes very powerful, then you got to really hope that it has goals that line up with the rest of humanity's goals. It's sort of similar to aliens showing up. If aliens showed up and were 1,000 times more powerful than us, then maybe the first thing we'd want to know is, are they friendly? So that's the sort of scenario. I think that the one thing that is different between artificial intelligence and a lot of the history of science is that with artificial intelligence, there's something like an internal logic to what the thing will do. So long as we understand the idea of something having instrumental goals, and we imagine that an artificial general intelligence will have instrumental goals. An instrumental goal is just, I'm hungry, so I go get some food so that I can eat so that I am not hungry. The doing X in order to do Y in order to do Z, that's instrumental goals. Well, there's a whole bunch of instrumental goals, and I think this is argued in a paper by Steve Alejandro, Basic AI Drives, but basically, once you have something that has some sufficiently normally specified goal, usually it also wants to stay alive or stay in existence. It also wants to increase its power so that it can accomplish its goal. It wants to prevent other things from stopping it from accomplishing its goal, and so on. And so I think there's an internal logic there that is really different from, so it's interesting. We're studying the history of electricity. The history of electricity ultimately relates to artificial intelligence because electricity will be the substrate that the thing is powered on. And so it's really quite shocking, no pun intended. It's terrible. You have all these, it's like really hard to avoid electricity jokes, but we should, keep that to a dull roar. Electricity, like the study of electricity gets started. I mean, the earliest part is people notice that if you rub amber, it attracts leaves and, chaff and feathers and things like that. And it's not just amber, a couple other gemstones as well. Roughly, this wasn't thought to be, this was, a curiosity, something interesting, but nothing of world-shaking importance. And then over the course of the development of the history of electricity, you have an increasing recognition of the power of this particular thing, but it's very hard to predict. One thing that occurs in the middle, this is in the 1700s, is the discovery of the capacitor or the Leyden jar. Essentially, you had a bunch of people, they'd figured out that you could rub certain materials and produce static electric attraction. They'd figured out that there were conductors and insulators. And you had some people were trying to figure out how to amplify the effect and store it. And they eventually converged on finding a particular thing, which was the Leyden jar, so a jar with water in it and sort of metal set up in the right way, but such that when you hold it and touch it, you get this absolutely enormous shock. And so then this was, a huge deal. The effect was really not foreseen. And then tons and tons of people started looking at it to understand it better. So if you go from like rubbing of amber to the Leyden jar, this was something that would be incredibly difficult to foresee. And then going from the Leyden jar to electrical current, electric lighting, and then computers, extremely difficult to foresee. And so, but then this is one of the things that I think is special about the topic of artificial intelligence, because we have an independent understanding of intelligence, at least to some degree, we could understand maybe a bit more about how an artificial intelligence would behave. So this is a way in which I think the history is not as helpful as understanding something like intelligence abstractly. That said, I do think that there are a lot of things that you can learn. In particular, one thing, so just picking from the history of electricity, because this is what we're studying right now, one thing that's fascinating about it is that at different eras, you get misinformation that makes it hard for there to be progress. So if you look at, for example, so the first era is the writing of the ancients, you have, ancient Greeks and Romans, and a bunch of them are commentators on nature, and they write down a lot of observations. And so some of them will note, amber when rubbed attracts leaves in chaff, and the same thing is true for ruby, and things like that. Weirdly, though, there's also just a bunch of false facts in their writings. It's and not just sort of, there's a couple tall tales, but they're also just false observational claims. So for instance, they said, well, amber doesn't attract basil or doesn't attract things when they're dipped in oil. Yep, nope, not true. Not true at all. They're just wrong about that. And those are observational claims. You'd think somebody would just sit there and rub some amber and hold it up to some basil and see whether it attracted. And maybe a bunch of them did, but at the very least, you had, I think it was Plutarch, the person with the this particular sort of piece of misinformation. But so then, if you were just looking at the texts from ancient Greece and Rome, there's some true information and there's some false information, and it's hard to tell what's going on. Flash forward to the Renaissance, you get more people doing these commentaries on nature, recording tons of facts, and they start to correct some of the misinformation. So you have some authors saying, okay, actually, yes, amber does attract basil. If you rub it, yes, that, the ancients were wrong about that. But they then add further sort of bits of misinformation. So like, for example, what's some examples? They add, that there's a story about gray amber attracting leaves from 2 feet away. Nope, doesn't seem like that one happened. And so you think, okay, well, that's interesting, of course, right? We know that so you get misinformation alongside the real information back with the ancients. You get misinformation alongside real information in the Renaissance. Well, could we learn anything about that? I think the answer is yes, because if you're trying to figure out, well, how worried should we be about artificial intelligence? One thing you should be paying attention to is how much progress is actually being made, right? There's a story according to which lots of progress is being made, and certainly some progress is being made, but I open up my browser here and search and find this article that's from Science that says eye-catching advances in some AI fields are not real. This is published in May of last year, so this is less than a year ago, and talks about how you've got lots of people working on different things like pruning algorithms, and these are supposed to make neural networks more efficient. But according to this article, they're rarely compared side by side and properly. So it's actually really hard to tell whether or not progress is being made. And just one more thing from this article, they, as a 2019 meta-analysis they refer to, they conclude that, quote, the high water mark was actually set in 2009. Well, okay, so, you have on one hand a lot, like there's the history of incredible advance in artificial intelligence, but on the other hand, there's this possibility for misinformation. And one thing we learn from the history of science is that there can come to be true facts alongside false ones, such that it's hard to actually tell what's happening. And so then there's an interesting question of whether this is happening in AI right now.
But this is more related not to the internal elements of the science of AI itself. It's more related to the information that is being let out related to the stage of the development, right?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe you could rephrase the question. I mean, it
Oh
sounds
well, so this the things you mention is the falsity of certain information and beliefs are
yeah,
related to the beliefs regarding the state of the innovation that is in the
yes,
AI, but not
yes.
necessarily to the contents of the science of machine learning itself.
Um, yeah, no, that's true. And I just picked one article off of the internet, but I think there's a really important question to ask, which is how much progress is actually happening in AI, right? So I think in analyzing this, one thing that's really, one thing that um, so you could think of these comments as sort of directed to an audience that is interested in understanding progress in AI, but are not themselves specialists. And so I'm not myself a specialist in AI, but I'm very interested to know how much progress is really being made. One thing that's important to take, and so you want to, on one hand, not just be a sort of naive optimist and believe everything you read. On the other hand, you don't want to bury your head in the sand and say, oh, well, progress, no progress is being made when progress is actually being made. The thing you want to do is you want to try to be realistic. And then this involves taking into account the quality of the information that's being provided. So one thing that is really notable is that essentially at most times and most places, in order to raise money to fund something, you have to raise money to fund it, and in order to do so, you need to have some sort of narrative of progress. Okay, so if you imagine there's a very strong selection effect. Imagine there are 100 different researchers, 20 of them think, no progress is being made. 60 of them think it's, mixed, and 20 of them are very optimistic and can, put together a persuasive story. All right, well, who raises money? Answer, obviously the ones who are more optimistic. And so then what this means is that there's a very strong selection effect for optimistic narratives in different areas. And so then this means, and this is going to be true for, startups that are raising money for their particular areas. You can't raise money on a story that your thing doesn't work. It's going to be true for science journalism, especially the more popular the journalism is, because your audience are technology enthusiasts. They're really excited about the end of the world, maybe. This is a funny thing where the people frequently don't admit that they're excited about the end of the world. They're like, oh, AI, it's, really bad. This is really exciting. um, but that's the audience. And so, more clicks if you cover that. And then, if progress isn't being made, maybe you don't even cover it at all. Little progress being made in field X. Seems like a pretty boring headline. And so there is a selection effect that causes a lot of enthusiasm to be expressed. And that can mislead people as to the actual state of the state of the field. There's actually a whole bunch of different things here, like one that cuts deeper. And you said, well, this is just about the technology, but not the actual conceptual underpinnings in machine learning and so forth. But one thing that's worth considering here is, even the phrase artificial intelligence. This, a lot of people are trying to create artificial intelligence, but I've heard some people refer to AI as automated statistics. A lot of what machine learning is, and it's automated statistics. automated statistics is going to undergo a massive, singularity level takeoff and change the world just sounds way less plausible than artificial intelligence will do it, right? And so there's the field of artificial intelligence, but then there's a lot of branding. And then there's a question of whether the thing we're dealing with is automated statistics or whether the thing we're dealing with is, the initial seeds of human intelligence in electronic form.
Yeah, but you could argue that, the human form is also automated statistics.
Well, you could argue that, but that is something that's at least baked into the branding, right? So you could imagine that if you say, so you could say, automated statistics is coming, which feels a lot different than artificial intelligence is coming. And that's because a lot of the audience doesn't share the assumption that intelligence is just automated statistics. So then what ends up happening is a lot of, it's a very persuasive way to tell a story. But, it's a good question. In the world where intelligence just is automated statistics, then it's not misleading. In the world where we'll actually know there's more to it or something different to it, then maybe it is. Now, I don't mean here to be saying that progress isn't being made. It clearly is. Like GPT-3, for example, released by OpenAI, is a really good example of recent progress in AI.
Could you say what is that exactly? Maybe not exactly, but briefly.
So GPT-3, again, so not a specialist, but and this actually was sort of the question that I wanted to raise, which is very interesting. So as far as I understand it, so GPT-3 is a machine learning model created by OpenAI, which is an AI company. And essentially it takes a huge corpus of texts and using something like automated statistics works out a whole bunch of different parameters and dimensions along which the texts differ, and then uses that to produce sort of roughly human level text on lots of different topics. Now, for people who haven't seen it, it's really quite astonishing. It's absolutely worth seeing. The text generated by GPT-3 is sometimes the thing produces really weird results, and you can tell that this is a computer making an error. But in lots of cases, it produces texts that seem pretty good. It produces press releases, for instance, where you're like, yep, that just looks like a regular press release that could have been written by a human, could be written by GPT-3. Now, I suspect that this is going to have a whole bunch of societal impacts. And so I think we want to sort of separate the question of, so there's one question is technological progress or advance occurring? I think the answer is yes. GPT-3 is clearly something new. One thing that's interesting actually is that people, when something really new occurs, it's in many cases quite discernible. It's like you look at it and you're like, oh yes, okay, that's new. And you change your expectations and you change your plans, or you're like, okay, well, shoot, now I don't know whether or not the text coming to me from whatever company was written by a human or was written by a GPT-3 in style, style or inspired algorithm. But so I think one question is this real progress? Answer is yes. Another question is, well, does this move us closer to instantiating intelligence electronically? Well, certainly it seems like the way that algorithms like this one work, it seems like they don't work in the way that the human brain does. I mean, you don't have humans absorbing gajillions of pages of text and then sort of averaging across all the things and then producing text on that basis. But it is producing an effect that looks a lot more like intelligence. And so I think the question around GPT-3 is a really good one. To what degree does this show us that we're closer to intelligence than, or does it mean that we're closer to intelligence instantiated artificially than we were before? Or to what degree does it show us that it's actually easier to use statistics to imitate certain features of certain things that the human mind can do.
That's a good point. I think it's important to differentiate in AI ethics between those two different issues, and one of them is singularity, and the second one is just applied machine learning algorithms in 2020. And in the last 5 years, you definitely are right. There's so much more progress in those commercially applied machine learning algorithms than in working towards singularity.
Yeah, and I mean, and this is, I mean, that's my view as well. I think there's a real opportunity for some like in-depth sort of reporting and sort of scientific analysis in an attempt to figure out how much progress is really being made. I think that, I mean, my impression, so, again, as a not a specialist in AI, the way that I gather information about this is by looking at what sorts of signs you would expect a field. And this, by the way, is one of the things I study. I look at what are the signs that a field would exhibit if progress is happening versus if progress is not, and then using that as a sort of outside view way to estimate what's happening on the inside. A very simple way to approach this is to ask people in the field and see what they say about various things. Now, obviously, there's ways that they can have more or less accurate information. But one thing that I've found in my conversations is that, there's a bit of disagreement, but for the most part, the people I've spoken to have said that there's not as much progress happening on the algorithmic level, and that what's happening instead is there's a lot more progress coming about as a result of increased computing power. And one of the stories that I've heard is that the current boom in machine learning, deep learning, and in general AI advances are coming about as a result of using old algorithms, or generally old algorithms developed, for example, like in the 60s or 70s, and then running a lot more computing power through them. This is really important for assessing the state of the field because we know that computers are getting faster. We know there's a lot more computing power. And then it matters whether or not there's progress in algorithms or just progress in computing power. That question by itself doesn't resolve the question of how much progress is being made towards an singularity style AI, because you have to answer the question of, well, how much progress do we need in software or in algorithms versus how much progress do we need in hardware? But I mean, I'm personally inclined to sort of have the view that there's been a lot of progress in hardware. There's been not much progress with respect to algorithms, and that a lot more progress in software algorithms would be necessary to get genuine or real AI. And then as a result of this, I'm more inclined to think that AI is not right on our doorstep, and that there is time for humanity to get its act together and pay attention to whether these things should be regulated.
Yeah, I agree. I recently read a paper that actually argued that even if we get much more computing power, we'll never achieve the singularity if we don't change the way we conceptually think about those algorithms. So even if you have amazing computers that are far above anything we can imagine now, we're never just, you can't just apply the same set of algorithms and expect there's some intelligence to emerge.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I expect as well. And then it's interesting because when you look at the different advances, then you could say, okay, well, how much are the advances coming from increased computing power versus how much are they coming from algorithms? And if it's mostly coming from increased computing power, that actually, in a lot of cases, you could think that, like, if you think it's about hardware, then as you scale up hardware and get more effects, you'll think that we're getting closer to an AI singularity. Whereas if you think that software is necessary, and in fact is the primary sort of thing that would be needed, then as people scale up hardware and we get more effects, the thing you're actually learning is that it's a lot easier to do certain activities than you thought. Right. So, like, for example, one thing with GPT-3, one thing that I thought was interesting was looking at, one of the texts that it had developed or that it produced involved telling a joke. And it was a novel joke. And it wasn't very funny, but it still was recognizably a joke. And you might think, well, either this shows us that we're getting closer to intelligence explosion, et cetera, because look, now it's telling jokes. Or you could think maybe jokes are based on a slightly simpler formulation than we thought. And then when you look at it, you're like, well, yeah, actually there are, a lot of pretty simple formulas for jokes. That's, it's pretty easy when you have a public speaker and they start off talking to tell a few jokes. Okay, well, probably means there's a formula. And if there's a simple formula, then maybe what's happening is we're not discovering how close we are to artificial and general intelligence. What we're actually discovering is here are further parts of reality that there are pretty simple rules for.
It goes back to the Chinese room argument, because I think what's going to happen earlier is that we're going to have those chatbots.
I mean, I think there's a bunch of this. I haven't looked into it too deeply, but there are, you've seen the movie Her, I assume, and there's the, the idea of your, AI assisted, romantic partner. But in a number of different places, like for instance, in China, you're seeing like a lot of uptake where more and more people are relying on AIs for as their romantic partner. And yeah, so I mean, I think that we're sort of there. That's happening.
Doesn't that tell us a lot about us as humans? Because you if I understood you correctly, you think that you didn't like it to refer to us as, what was the phrase you used?
What, automated statistics?
Yes, you didn't think that's very accurate. But if you think about how a man can fall in love, the innate feelings we have, the feelings of love, is kind of easily foolable. And I'm not sure what does it say about the feeling itself. Does it kind of disprove it? Does it not matter at all?
Well, this is great. I mean, it's we're talking about AI and love in the modern world. I think people are really complex, actually. I think there's one read on which the fact that people are falling in love with chatbots, like one, a more cynical interpretation is that, yeah, it's really easy to fool humans, and humans' emotional systems are really simple. But I'm not actually inclined to draw that conclusion. I think that what's happening much more is that, I mean, I suspect it to be something more like, I mean, imagine you have people who grew up in, more atomized society. So our society over the last, while has been becoming more and more atomized. And this is true in the US and China and elsewhere. And as people are one thing that's certainly the case is that you've seen the rise of really powerful central governments. Even, China's an obvious example, but even if, in the US, where it's like decentralized to a much greater degree, it's still an extremely powerful central authority. And people have a lot less in the way of interpersonal, like sort of, there's family ties are less strong. Like in the US, we have tons of, the nuclear family as a social technology doesn't seem to be lasting particularly well. And then, a result of the one-child policy for China is that people end up not having any cousins. The result of this, I think, is that you have humans who are adapted to an environment that's much stranger than anyone that we've been in before. And so then the ways that humans will seek connection, I think, will be modified by that. If people are less comfortable with people, it's not necessarily that they're being fooled. It might be that the thing that's really happening is safety. It might be that having a live human there who could change or could judge you badly is actually too unsafe for people. And so then while the thing they really want is the deep, complex interpersonal interaction, it's something that they don't know how to deal with. And so then they're going for the next best thing. So this is a version on which it's not so much that they're being tricked, like in a way they're like, allowing themselves to be tricked, but they know that it's not the thing that they're actually going for, but it's the best they can get given how hard it is to relate to other people.
Perhaps if you think about that like in a philosophical way, if you think about like hedonism, perhaps that would be preferable for a human, surprisingly. It seems like maybe perhaps it would somehow benefit the society if people would choose to love robots.
Well, I mean, I think that sort of overall we're in a pretty tough spot, because I think that the romantic ideal, as I understand it, and here obviously these issues are super complex and it's hard to be definitive about any of it, but even the romantic ideal as itself feels like it's a reaction to society. It's like when you have people pair off and sort of stand, it's like the romantic ideal is it's like the two people standing together against society. Well, there's this against society part. And then prior to the development of the more modern ideal for romantic love, you have things like love and marriage playing very different roles in society. So I think what's happening is that there's some sort of basic sort of human drive at work here. Love is obviously super important, but it's manifesting itself in really different ways depending on the nature of society. It's not that surprising to me that, so many of the romantic stories you end up with the lovers kill themselves, like Romeo and Juliet, because part of the romantic ideal involves this stand against society. But then, that makes me wonder, well, maybe the direction to go, isn't, chat bots rather than humans. Maybe the thing we need to do is figure out how to have ideals for humans relating to each other that includes a more healthy relation to society as a whole.
If we go back to the ideas related to knowledge, in your interview with Steve Patterson, you mentioned how different societies have different concepts of knowledge. Yes. So, for example, in ancient Greece, there were many words to describe knowledge, such as techne or episteme, which describe different areas of knowledge. That suggests that society back then was concerned with knowledge. And as you explained, nowadays, we have many words describing, for example, messaging, which would show that this is what society is largely concerned with. And I was wondering, if we speculate that AI singularity is going to happen, will society be at all interested in science itself, if any human could be easily outperformed by a machine and all science will be likely conducted by computers? Or will just science die as an interest of society?
Well, this is a really interesting question, and I think we should distinguish a few scenarios. So the first one is, if you actually get, artificial general intelligence takeoff, then I suspect humans aren't going to really be around during that time to be doing any science, though maybe the AI will do science, we won't know about it. But if you imagine that humans somehow survive, then it's a really interesting question what people would do if you figured out how to, I would assume that if, in the more extreme scenarios, but where humanity still survives, humanity is going to choose to upgrade itself in some sort of really substantial way. And then once you do that, then the question is really about the size of the frontier. It could be that we figure out all the science that there is to be figured out, and then the only thing left to do is think about numbers. And then we could sit there and, there's an infinite number of different mathematical truths. Maybe there's only a finite number of accessible scientific truths. So in that sort of scenario, maybe everybody ends up spending a lot more time doing pure math. But I think in a scenario where you have a more limited takeoff, where takeoff, I think, indicates it's being unlimited. But if you imagine that you get more advanced AI, then I actually think that the danger here, there's actually an important danger, which is that you could end up in a situation where humans come to believe that AI is more powerful than them, that it's smarter than they are. Computers can already calculate much better than humans can. And computers can factor prime numbers much more quickly. It's also the case that computers can go through millions of pages of text much more quickly. Well, you could imagine that as this happens, you could imagine humans end up getting outclassed in different domains. That can be totally fine if we now think about the AI as a tool. Like now we have calculators, that's fine. We just use them when we want to calculate numbers. But you could imagine humans deciding to cede the area of science and more generally the areas of innovation and creativity to computers before computers actually know how to do it. And so in that circumstance, you might end up, I see lots of people really excited about using science and machine learning, using AI and machine learning and so forth to make progress in science. That seems to me to be really quite hard to do, maybe AGI complete. And I suspect that the reason that's happening is that they themselves are less confident that we as humans can make the progress. This is one of the reasons I'm interested in early stage science, because I think there are substantial problems with the scientific endeavor now in society. Like, again, social science and the replication crisis, you've got psychology, tons of the studies come back as not replicating, at least a high, the percentages vary from study to study, but it's high enough that it makes you call into question, results generally in the field, because you can't tell the real results from the fake ones or the false ones. In that sort of circumstance, there's a question of like, well, what, maybe you could think of it as like a path with three, a juncture in the road with three paths. We could keep doing the thing we're doing, but do it more rigorously. This is like when people propose that we lower p-values to, instead of less than 0.05 as the measure for statistical significance, lower it to 0.01, or use pre-registration or other sort of various types of changes to sort of the standard scientific process in these fields. That's like a do what we're doing, but do it more. You could imagine that then there's a branch which is, well, clearly we as humans are having problems. So let's move humans out and bring in the AIs and see whether or not, some automated statistics can help us to do better than we've done before. But I'm most optimistic about the third path, which is to understand how people in practice made scientific breakthroughs. Because I think that there are still scientific breakthroughs that can be made that computers are nowhere near being able to do. And that rely much more on the sort of patterns of exploration and thought that occurred back when different sciences were getting going, rather than nowadays. And so, this is like one simple example. There's an interesting question of when should you quantify inside of a scientific field. You might think, well, numbers are good and reality is, been revealed to be very substantially mathematical, so we should quantify as soon as possible. But looking at the history of electricity, it looks like, and this is, preliminary result, we're studying this, and there's even indications that this is true in magnetism, that there were some cases where people, it seems like, tried to quantify and apply numbers to the areas, but did so before there was enough conceptual clarity, and that these initial attempts at quantification didn't actually end up working or being that helpful, whereas quantification later, after things had been worked out more, actually ended up working. And so then there's this question, are the social sciences engaged in premature quantification? And if they are, then maybe rather than going in the direction of even more quantification, maybe the thing we need to do is start to learn again about how to think qualitatively.
I would love to expand on that, but we're running out of time. So this is just one last question for the podcast promotion. The question is AI going to kill us all?
I think the answer is it's not going to kill us all. And that's because it's possible for humanity to choose to shape its own destiny in terms of the path through the technological landscape. And I think people will figure out how to make good choices with regard to that. It's a very difficult challenge, but I believe we can do it.
Thank you so much for appearing on the podcast.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider to like, subscribe, and share. I also recommend following the AI Tomorrow podcast on Twitter and Instagram to make sure you don't miss out on any clips from future episodes.